Professor Rafal Soborski, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
Thank you very much for having me.
Let me start right away with the first question. You have argued that populism lacks ideological coherence. How would you categorize Karol Nawrocki's brand of politics, Trumpian, nationalist, anti-liberal, within your broader critique of the term populism?
So I don't think mine is a critique of the term populism as such, but instead, what I would argue, and I am of course far from being original here, is that approaching populism as an ideology, even a thin one, is misguided. Incidentally, the author to whom we owe the concept of thin-centered ideology, Michael Frieden, does not think populism qualifies as one. So it doesn't qualify as a worldview. According to Frieden, thin-centered ideologies have a restricted conceptual core, restricted range of concepts, and hence need broader, more mature ideologies such as liberalism or socialism to serve as their hosts. But the thin-centered ideologies are still more complex than populism. So think of nationalism, feminism, perhaps ecologism. On the other hand, populism revolves merely around the opposition between the decent people and the corrupted elite. And this is not enough to construct a worldview that any ideology is expected to offer. Of course, you can further distinguish between right wing populism, left wing populism, and so on, but such distinctions often reveal that populism does not really make much sense as an ideological category. So, both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have been described as populists, but their views are dramatically different, right? During the pandemic, I analyzed approaches to COVID-19 that others had categorized as populist, and I showed that there was no consistent pattern or any general similarities in terms of the track record, in terms of the success or otherwise of so-called populist policies. And that, in fact, the major factor was the degree of neoliberalization. So I think it is better to keep populism as a description of the type of political communication, the style of political communication, and perhaps also the convention breaking behavior of some politicians, including dressing down, swearing, smoking, in the case of Nawrocki, sniffing snus during TV debates with Trzaskowski. But the populist manner may carry very different ideological and political messages. And in that sense, it may be better to speak of populist nationalism, populist socialism, rather than vice versa, rather than socialist populism. Populism then becomes just a description of the style in which a given ideology is conveyed. As for Nawrocki, I think all of the adjectives that you have mentioned, Trumpian, nationalist, anti-liberal, could potentially apply. Though, of course, they are different categories. Trumpism seems to have an obvious meaning. It's a blend of hostile grievances against all kinds of minorities and some pernicious establishment, which is, of course, ironic considering Trump's own status. And Trumpism is expressed more as ephemeral sound bites than coherent ideas. We've become used to that with Donald Trump. Trump is also associated with political transactionism, bringing his personal monetary interest quite unashamedly into politics, which also affects what he says and how he says it. So it remains to be seen if Nawrocki tries to emulate this. Is Nawrocki a nationalist? Certainly, and it is a nationalism that thrives on and stirs up collective fears and collective resentment in a volatile world whose complexities this kind of nationalism oversimplifies. Anti-liberal? Well, absolutely. However, I think we need to be fair and wait and see who Nawrocki turns out to be ideologically when in office. We need to remember that until he was selected by Jarosław Kaczyński as ostensibly non-partisan candidate, but really the candidate of Law and Justice, he had been almost a complete unknown to the wider public. So I think we need to wait and see what happens.
Okay. Nawrocki's victory, despite limited presidential powers, signals a cultural and ideological shift. How do you interpret the symbolic power of his win for the love and justice, peace movement, and the populist right in Poland?
I am not sure if Nawrocki's victory represents a fundamental shift in Polish politics. I was saddened by his victory. I was disappointed by Trzaskowski's loss, as Nawrocki's presidency is unlikely to benefit Poland or Europe. But I was not at all surprised by this victory of Nawrocki. We need to remember that Law and Justice is the largest party in the Polish parliament, with over 35% of the seats. In 2023, Donald Tusk's civic platform won 30%, and it was only a very small increase in comparison to the 2019 elections when they received 27%. So Tusk is a prime minister in a not so coherent coalition, which consists of his party and three other parties: center right, Third Way, conservative Polish People's Party, and a Social Democratic New Left. Also, we should keep in mind the conservative nature of Polish society at large. Of course, this is a sort of generalization, but I think it's confirmed by recent developments. And, I've listened to your very interesting interview with Professor Markowski. And although I would like to agree with him that the majority of Poles are liberal and cosmopolitan, I cannot. I think his perspective on Poland diverges from what Poland outside of the major cities like Warsaw, Wrocław, or Krakow thinks. The rural or provincial Poland is far less cosmopolitan, far less progressive, in my opinion. And the key point is that Poland's urban population is not large enough to counterbalance this. Another thing is that the popularity of the right is underrated by polls and pundits. And we know this by now. We've seen that in the case of Trump twice and others. And now we see this with Nawrocki. We keep forgetting that voters are often disinclined to admit their right wing views. Most importantly, I don't think that Nawrocki's victory will amount to an extremely radical change in comparison with what we have today. And that's not just because the current president is as much of an obstruction to the coalition government, but also because the government led by Tusk has not made much progress on major social issues such as civil partnerships, has not changed discourse or policy around, for instance, refugees. The discourse of Tusk's party, the Civic Platform, was drifting towards the right during the presidential campaign, which was a very unwise move. And here I agree fully with Professor Markowski. Ultimately, why would right-wing voters support an imitation when they have the original? I think Nawrocki's victory will consolidate the power of Law and Justice. I regret to be forecasting this, but the last 2 years have been wasted with the government fixated mainly on political revenge and uncovering cases of Law and Justice's corruption. This is certainly important, but should have been complemented by a program that would attract a wider public, aside from the core supporters of Civic Platform and business people whose fiscal burden, including employers' contribution to the country's health services, the government has been trying to reduce. So I don't think it's such a radical shift.
Right. You have called for taking ideology seriously in times of crisis. What ideological threads beyond vague populism do you see underpinning Nawrocki's support base and discourse?
Thank you for this question. Yes, I think political ideology should be taken seriously, and I discussed this in my work for years. However, ideology has undergone a radical transformation in recent decades, becoming increasingly fragmented, becoming increasingly fluid, ephemeral, reacting haphazardly to rapid social political changes. So traditional left-right distinctions have blurred. They have given way to hybrid belief systems and situational politics, featuring often contradictory positions depending on the issue at hand, emerging at any moment. Of course, social media have accelerated this shift as well, favoring meme-driven and personality-centered politics over more durable, collectively held ideological commitments. And comprehensive worldviews are losing ground to issue-based activism, identity politics, and also algorithmically reinforced echo chambers. So ideology has changed, and far-right politics provides a particularly revealing lens through which to analyze ongoing ideological transformations. So the far right today combines elements of nationalism, traditionalism, libertarianism, conspiracism, accelerationism, you name it, into an unstable and contradictory but potent political force. The far right also engages in constructing and mobilizing its followers around myths, political myths of civilizational decline, national betrayal, demographic apocalypse. It offers emotionally charged narratives of victimization and redemption. So, for example, the Great Replacement myth frames migration as an existential threat to the West. The deep state conspiracy envisions elites orchestrating some global control, global takeover. And the far right relies on such narratives, positing moralized struggle between the people and their perceived enemies, and seems to be capitalizing on the fears that these cause. Overall, I think what we witness is ideological balkanization, adherence to tribalism over universalism, feeling over reasoning, and it's going in that direction. But this does not mean that we should be paying less attention to these fragmented new forms of ideology. Ideology scholars should really be exploring ideology in its different expressions, whether they are sophisticated and structured or crass and fleeting. For better or worse, this is how we tend to think politically today, and we should be studying this. However, coming back to Nawrocki, I think it is likely that he will be blending different ideological themes. And it seems certain to me that it will be a narrative mobilizing collective exclusionary emotions over reasoning. But still, as I said earlier, I think we need to wait and see. His political communication thus far has been subject to pressures of electoral competition, much more than what he will be when he's in office, with at least 5 years of presidency ahead of him. So, perhaps he will continue this kind of discourse, or perhaps he will change. We'll see.
Right. How does Nawrocki's alignment with Trumpism reflect broader transnational ideological flows between far-right actors across the Atlantic? Are we seeing a global ideological bloc emerging?
That's a great question. And, far right ideologies take increasingly transnational forms. And this includes emergence of different forms of civilizationism, variously aligning with or transcending nationalism or racism. So, with my colleagues at London Metropolitan University, Professor Michał Garapich and Dr. Anna Jochimek, we've been working on a project funded by the UK's Economic and Social Research Council, studying the emerging transnational Polish-British far right. And we see a significant number of Polish migrants in Britain recruited by British far right organizations. And we also see British far right leaders and activists visiting Poland, for example, to take part in Polish Independence March on 11/11, which is probably the world's largest transnational far right hub, as well as symbolic space for reproduction of political myths. Far right cooperation is thus both a matter of ideological synergy, but also financial benefits. Far-right influencers play an increasingly important role, and there is money around them, right? So, for example, one Polish-British far-right PR expert has been behind the rightward shift of Elon Musk, and both have promoted the staunchly pro-Israeli Islamophobic far-right influencer Tommy Robinson. So, in that sense, I think an ideological bloc has already emerged, and this far right of today does have both its base and its superstructure using the Marxian terminology. But having said all that, far right nationalism's logic is not really given to cooperation, to put this mildly, and as we know from history. So I anticipate all kinds of tensions, potentially conflicts emerging, and I don't think that a robust, coherent far right international is likely in that sense.
Right. With Navrosky now positioned to veto progressive reforms by Tusk government, are we witnessing a new phase of institutional gridlock engineered by ideological confrontation between liberalism and authoritarian conservatism?
I think this is highly likely, but I don't think, to be honest, that Tusk's government would have done much, even with a president from its own side. The coalition is too divided on social issues and has been, I have to say this with regret, highly ineffective. And Tusk's party itself is really right wing. I mean, in Western standards, this is a neoliberal slash neoconservative party. It resembles the Tories under Cameron before they shift in a far right direction. So yes, but I don't think that it would be a very dramatic change in relation to what we have.
Right. Do you foresee PiS leveraging the presidency to engineer a strategic comeback in 2027, thereby locking in illiberal reforms? If so, how might ideology serve as the vehicle of this restoration?
Hmm. Well, I think the broad ideological outlook of law and justice will remain as it is. Traditional, conservative on social issues, and protectionist, some would say, drifting towards the left on economic issues. At the same time, the populist nationalism that law and justice represents, as I said earlier, thrives on imagining enemies and hostile forces. So at one point, it was the LGBT community that law and justice stigmatized, with some regions and locations under the control of the party declaring themselves to be LGBT free zones. At other points, it was refugees from the Middle East, whom Kaczynski presented in a language resembling Nazi rhetoric, really, namely as carriers of dangerous diseases. So I think now, with a rapid growth of the Ukrainian population in Poland following Russian invasion of Ukraine, law and justice will be keen to capitalize on any emerging fears and tensions between the Polish population and the Ukrainian minority in Poland, and that this will be used to engineer this strategic comeback in 2027.
Right. In your analysis, how does neoliberalism continue to structure Polish politics even amidst this nationalist anti-liberal wave? Can we speak of an illiberal neoliberalism in the Polish context?
This is an interesting question. Scholars debate if we still live in a neoliberal era. So Trump's tariffs, Brexit, etc., seem to be perhaps contradicting this. But neoliberalism, and by this I mean a crass version of 19th century economic liberalism, not a paradigm in the studies of international relations, also known as neoliberalism. So, this economic theory has been a hegemonic ideology for so long that even if we are to assume its terminal decline, in the near future, it will continue resonating for some time, I think. And by the way, the end of neoliberalism was pronounced a few times before, especially when the 2008 economic crisis, the gravest one since 1929, revealed the serious flaws of neoliberalism. And then during the pandemic, when suddenly the state, which neoliberals tend to blame for all problems, proved indispensable, and neoliberal regimes coped with the pandemic far worse, far less effective than the more social democratic statist ones. Now, neoliberalism is compatible with authoritarianism. So think of Chile under Pinochet's rule, for instance. But as far as law and justice is concerned, I am not sure if the party represents illiberal neoliberalism. Neoliberals preach that markets are always right. They don't find inequality to be a problem. They promote austerity and rolling back of the welfare state. And law and justice, on the other hand, is actually quite statist in approach, supportive of the welfare state for whichever reasons, usually just electoral reasons, but still. And big projects like, for instance, the central airport in Poland that now is in a bit of a limbo. Economic inequalities, we have to keep this in mind. Under law and justice's government declined in Poland. Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, fluctuated during law and justice years, but was never higher than in 2015 and is now significantly below EU's average. So I wouldn't describe them as illiberal neoliberals. They are certainly illiberal, but probably not neoliberal.
Right. Your recent co-authored work shows how Polish migrants in the UK are co-opted into transnational far-right movements. How might Nawrocki's presidency reinforce or reshape diasporic nationalism and transnational far-right solidarities?
Thank you very much for this question. This is the topic that I'm working on with Professor Karapich and Dr. Jechimek at LMU. Well, Poland is often seen by the global far right as a nationalist haven that remains relatively homogeneous ethnically, that remains traditional, conservative, and has also been very economically successful in recent decades while maintaining a strong identity. And this kind of perception has been articulated, reinforced by all kinds of far right influencers, but also Donald Trump, when he visited Warsaw during his first presidency. He chose Warsaw as the location for his main European talk, main European speech, rather, often described by scholars as the major narrative of Western civilizationist populism. I think the perception of Poland, this perception of Poland has been undermined by the 2023 elections and the premiership of the globalist Donald Tusk, as he is seen by the far right. But if law and justice regains power in 2027, then the far right narrative about Poland as a model country is likely to make a comeback. I already mentioned our work on Polish migrants in Britain, one of the largest minorities in the country. At this point, approximately 700,000 Poles live in Britain, and their voting patterns are interesting. They are different from how Poles living in, for example, the United States or Canada vote. So in the first round of the presidential elections, almost 36% voted for, of those who voted for Trzaskowski. But then he was followed by two far-right candidates, Menton, over 18%, and Brown, who got over 14%. And Nawrocki was only fourth, with just 13%. So it seems that Polish right-wing migrants in Britain prefer either the more extreme narrative coming from Brown, which is messianic, anti-Semitic, extremely homophobic, or the more economically libertarian far-right views of Menton. And the latter may be explicable, the popularity of the latter may be explicable by the fact that many Poles living in Britain are, self-employed and hence averse to big state and high taxation. But in the second round, Trzaskowski got almost 61%. So, we should keep in mind that the majority of Poles in Britain, firstly, the majority of them are not interested in politics and do not vote. Those who vote ultimately voted for the centrist candidate. Now, coming back to Nawrocki, only time will tell what his win means for transnational far-right solidarities. What we know is that Law and Justice government until 2023, so for 8 years, supported symbolically and financially various initiatives of the Polish diaspora in Britain, excuse me, that were of far-right nature, and the British press did register this. More broadly, more taking a more global perspective, as the far right assumes an increasingly civilizationist posture, transnational far right ideologies, activism, symbolism will become more important, I'm sure, reinforcing these solidarities that you've asked about. However, as I already said, we should not forget the lesson from history that collision course is inherent in nationalism, and such friendships are likely to be subordinated and perhaps ultimately trumped by jingoistic passions.
Right. What are the ideological weaknesses of the liberal opposition in Poland, particularly in the light of Tchaikovsky's narrow laws? Is managerial centrism enough to challenge the far right's mobilizing narratives?
Uh, well, it certainly is not enough, I would say. And this can be seen not just in Poland, but also in other places, including Germany or Britain, where even when the center wins elections, it then limits itself in office to this very managerialism you mentioned, without a compelling vision of its own. It tends to mimic instead the narratives of the right. Think of Keir Starmer's shift to the right in recent months, or Scholz when he was Germany's chancellor. There are many other examples. And I think this was also a mistake of the coalition government in Poland. The rightward shift in rhetoric around migration, for example, no progress whatsoever on the promises made to the LGBT community. And of course, I know that this was caused by the coalition being divided on the question, but why would voters take into consideration the inner workings of the governing coalition? They generally expect results, right? So I know that many leftists did vote for Trzaskowski, perhaps with a heavy conscience. I would have liked many more of them to vote for him just to avoid having a nationalist with a shady past as a president of the country. But Trzaskowski himself should have shifted in a more progressive direction. For example, I don't think he convinced anyone by hiding the rainbow flag that was handed to him by Nawrocki during one of the debates. And then it was quickly taken over from Trzaskowski by a left wing candidate. So this alienated many people on the left, members of the LGBT community, I presume as well, while not convincing anyone on the right who had seen Trzaskowski before participating in pride marches in Warsaw. So, this was inconsistent, and shifting to the right will not work.
Right. How should pro democratic forces in Poland reframe their political project to contest both the nationalist cultural agenda and the underlying neoliberal consensus you critique?
Uh, I think it is evident from what I had said so far that my political views are leftist and progressive. I would like to see pro-democratic forces in Poland challenging the right rather than hoping in vain that they can occupy some of the right's discursive territory. I would like to see an open, pro-European Poland respecting minorities and celebrating diversity. But I would also like to see the importance of social class really appreciated by Polish progressive politicians. The liberal center and even the liberal left sometimes appear to believe that class is no longer a significant dimension of identity or social stratification. They see class as a concept that was relevant in the industrial era, in the 19th century, early 20th century, but not in an information and service based society of today. But the concept of class describes an economic relationship, and anyone working for wages, not living off rent or interest, belongs to the working class. So to appeal to this huge group, pro-democratic forces should start talking about the 4-day working week more loudly, about universal income, universal benefits, especially in the context of AI, which will likely eliminate a wide range of professions, a wide range of jobs, or rather it will replace humans in those jobs. The Razem party in Poland has started this conversation, and I think this is the way to go, rather than caring mainly for the interests of a small number of wealthy individuals or entrepreneurs, however important they may be for the economy. We should also remember on this point that some of the people who voted for Law and Justice, I suspect a significant share of the party's electorate, chose it because of the range of benefits, social benefits, welfare benefits that the party has introduced or expanded, hence, as I mentioned, reducing inequalities while at the same time sustaining economic growth. So I think a social democratic solidarist response, protecting the poor while shifting more of the financial burden towards the privileged few, is what I would recommend. And I would recommend this both in principle and also strategically as a way to weaken, to defeat law and justice.
Right. And finally, Professor Soborski, given the gender and education-based electoral cleavages evident in the runoff, how might intersectional ideological analysis help explain and perhaps overcome these divisions?
Well, most of the cleavages were not that surprising. Big cities for Trzaskowski, provincial Poland for Nawrocki. Western Poland for Trzaskowski, Eastern Poland for Nawrocki. Education was, of course, a big factor as well. But what I would like to highlight, what came unexpectedly, was the support far-right candidates Mentzen and Brown received from young people, who then in the second round voted primarily for Nawrocki. So clearly, this is a group for whom Civic Platform, the coalition government, does not seem to have a convincing offer. And I already explained what I see as the right response.
Okay, Professor Rafal Soborski, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.